Hello, and welcome to the Giants Next Door, where we speak with the leaders shaping Australia's future through deeper engagement with Asia. Here, we talk with some of the country's key business figures about their relationship with Asia and hearing their insights and reflections on what it takes to lead, build, and succeed in the region. My guest today is Louise Adams, CEO of Aurecon. Louise has built an extraordinary career leading engineering and infrastructure projects globally, including across Southeast Asia, from Laos and Vietnam to Singapore and Malaysia. She now leads Aurecon's global strategy and plays a broader national role as Australia's business champion to Vietnam and an advisor to the ASEAN-Australia Centre. Louise combines deep on-the-ground experience with boardroom leadership and brings sharp insight into what it takes to build long-term partnerships across the region. Louise, welcome to the Giants Next Door podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Excellent. Louise, I'm really curious about your first experiences in Asia, particularly professionally, and I believe that consisted of a short stint in Laos, based out of Bangkok. When you think back about that first interaction, what really stood out in terms of the working environment, the culture, the communication styles?
Yeah, well, I came across to Bangkok. I was based in our office there. At the time, I was working over in the UK, so I was there for a couple of months, and we were doing this big hydroelectric dam over in Laos, as you say. And I thought, it was a wonderful experience. I was sort of in my mid-20s, and it was great to be able to see a part of the world at the same time as I was working. Professionally, it was a big project, and it was probably like most other places. We didn't get to go out onto site, and too often we were sort of in the office doing the design engineering in the background. But certainly living in Bangkok over my eyes, it's such a big, bustling city. Even back then, it was a great place to be able to live, and just getting to the office in the morning and walking home, just an eye-opening experience, walking around, seeing people go about their daily lives and probably getting an insight into a city that wasn't necessarily the tourist, the normal tourist approach. So it was a great way to spend your time. And it's part of why I love being an engineer. You can get to see the world while you do your day job.
Excellent. Was that a huge contrast to what you're used to? And did it really shift how or did you have to shift how you approach meetings and interactions?
Yeah, look, I was probably fairly junior in my career at the time, so I didn't have a lot of interactions. We had interactions with our local staff in the office there. We had a reasonably sized office in Bangkok, but everybody was so open and friendly and warm and welcoming. And I found that the same just walking around Bangkok, particularly when you would come across the same people each day. I remember I would come downstairs out of the apartment I was staying in, and on my way to work, and there was this old man who had this fruit cart, and so every morning I got into the habit of getting some pineapple off of him, and he would see me coming and he'd get the pineapple out, and he couldn't speak much English and I couldn't speak much Thai, so it was an interesting interaction. But little things like that you adjust to, but you find a way. And I think you always, you just have fun with it. And as long as you've got a smile on your face, I think most people react pretty well. It certainly was an adjustment, just the how busy the city was, and very different to. I had sort of lived and worked I'd grown up in regional South Australia, lived and worked in Adelaide. I've spent some time in the UK in Cambridge, and so this was probably the first massive city that I'd ever been in, and the hustle and bustle of it, and people constantly sort of trying to get your attention. It was definitely different.
Yeah, amazing. So fast forward to today, you've spent 2 decades working in so many countries. If we look at some of the Asian ones, particularly Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam and Singapore, were there any other early moments that really shifted the way you saw the world or, started to influence your work and leadership style?
Yeah, certainly when I was later in my career, I was based here in Australia, but spending a lot of time up in the region in leadership roles. But I certainly lent into listening a lot more and having a lot more time to take in what people were saying and probably being a little bit more flexible with my leadership approach, trying to, especially I had been in cultures, I was in the Middle East before I did that, so I knew what it was to have to adapt to a different culture. And I think probably from that, I knew that my best approach to learn what was going to work Australasia was to sit back and listen and to pay a little bit more attention, not to make assumptions about what would land and what wouldn't land if I was trying to drive change or trying to get a message across. And I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned in the last decade of my career was going around the various Asian cultures was, of course, not falling into the trap that assumes that there's one approach even for the whole of Asia. There's very, very variable cultures through Asia and in particular through Southeast Asia. And again, it's, I think, about just being willing to listen and learn and open your eyes and you watch other people interact and pick up on, those little subtle cultural nuances that are very different to what we're used to, perhaps in Australia and the UK, and are very variable across Southeast Asia in and of itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, particularly hearing how you still draw on those formative experiences today in leadership. So quite interesting. So now that you're leading Aurecon's global strategy, I'm also very curious. How do you think Australia's approach to engaging with Asia and Australian executives' approach to engaging Asia has changed over the years?
Well, we certainly learned in Aurecon. I would say we've had more success in the last decade in Asia than we had in the prior 4 decades. I think we're coming up to 50 years since we first went up to Singapore in a couple of years. So we've certainly come a lot further in the last decade. And that was because we really came to that realization that we needed to have leaders that were local. We needed to have our leader for the whole of Asia, because we sort of pull it all together as one geography. They needed to be up in the region, and then we needed local leadership in each of the countries. And we still could anchor that in a commonality across Aurecon, anchor it in sort of a culture that was common to Australia and New Zealand and Asia, but we needed, perhaps that commonality was sort of 70 or 80%, and then the next 20 or 30% was more localised and more appropriate on the ground. Prior to that, we had probably tried to lead it from Australia, and I think that's a big trap to fall into. You have to spend time up in the region. You have to kind of get to know people. You have to form relationships. You have to sort of do your time in the locations and really understand who the players are. What are your clients' issues, and that just takes time and engagement. So I think that's one big lesson that Australian businesses that are going up into the region need to learn. Another thing that I've picked up through the business champion role that I've held is probably that sometimes businesses or Australians if we haven't spent much time up in the region, we can have a fairly outdated view of what value we can bring to the region. We look at it more as in, well, okay, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to sell this product, or I'm going to teach this thing, or I'm going to provide this service, perhaps not appreciating how advanced Southeast Asia is itself and how the different countries and economies operate. And, especially when it comes to digital and technology, if I think about Vietnam, you can go to Vietnam and, they've got some absolute top-class capabilities and skills and some great companies that are leading the way in tech. So I think also, that's why you need to spend time up there, because, like I say, I think sometimes you can have a fairly outdated view of what value you can bring to the region. So I think there are a couple of things. The third point that I would make is probably when you're thinking about strategically how long you want to be up there, what your investment might look like, and how quickly you expect a return on that investment. I think sometimes in Australia, we can have an expectation that we're going to be able to get quick investments. We're looking a quarter at a time, perhaps not looking so into the future long term. And I think the region, because of the need to form those relationships, you just have to have a longer term view and a willingness to invest. And so looking at, well, what can the region do for my business over the 5 to 10 year period, rather than thinking I'm just going to get there and smash out some quick short-term returns for myself.
Yeah, excellent. Some really good points there. Harking back to the piece around localisation, in my time in the region, I'd almost say that's one of the biggest make or break factors. If I look at organisations, particularly Australian ones that have gone on to success, or to contrast them with the ones that have not found success and are sometimes scratching their heads about why, localization of both product and services, being customized to the local market, but also people and talent.
Yeah.
It's really a standout in terms of, if I think of most of the case studies, it's really been the make or break factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's still opportunities for expats to go up and have a thriving career up there. But I think it is about moving talent. If we move talent between our Asian business and our Australian business and our New Zealand business, and we sort of make an effort to try and do that, so that we have leaders that eventually, if they make their way up to the top of Aurecon, who have that breadth of experience and that international experience. I think long term, it's a huge benefit to the organisation, especially if, like Aurecon, we consider ourselves to be an Asia Pacific organisation. We very much consider ourselves to be playing in this whole region, in the whole neighbourhood, and therefore it's really important for us to develop talent that understands that holistic approach and the different needs of all those different parts of the business.
You've taken on some big roles outside Aurecon too, like Australia's Business Champion of Vietnam and as an advisor to the Australian ASEAN Centre. How have those experiences added to your understanding of the region?
Oh, look, I think they've certainly accelerated it. The business champion role has given me, a much broader knowledge of different industries and different business opportunities through Vietnam. My background is being professional services, so it's been a really steep learning curve to lean into and talk to people about products and trading in import and export in the product area. It's not something that I've had any background in, so I've been intrigued and constantly learning by some of the ideas that people have and the products that they want to sell, and how you go and take a product, whether it's from Australia to Vietnam or Vietnam to Australia, and the work that the governments do to support, the work that entities like Austrade do to support that. I think I probably didn't really appreciate just how important those entities were, and how many opportunities there are out there, particularly around that small to medium. I think I have also learned a lot more about that small to medium enterprise world, having always worked in Aurecon, and Aurecon always having been a pretty large corporate body. So no, it's been a lot of fun and really eye-opening, but it certainly has enhanced my understanding of the region, and the advisory board too has been interesting. I probably haven't been on that quite as long, but just meeting such a broad array of even my colleagues on that advisory board and seeing learning and listening to them and how they view the world. I think it's always great to meet different people that have very different perspectives of the world, so that you can come outside of your little bubble. And mine's very much infrastructure focused and engineering focused. So yeah, I've learnt a lot through it, and certainly learnt that there's a lot of people out there that I think know a hell of a lot more about places like Vietnam than I do. But I learn off them and hopefully give them a little bit back in return.
I expect you've been exposed to some pretty high-level conversations in those roles, both on the Australian side and on the Southeast Asia side and Vietnam side. Have any of the topics of conversations or issues that people raise, have any of those surprised you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when I've been in those conversations, a lot of the time with people talking about the global context, a lot of conversations more recently about the impact that geopolitics is having on redefining trade, and, the impact of tariffs and all of the sort of conversations that you'd expect. Look, I think the only thing that genuinely surprises me, and whenever I get the chance to talk to businesses, particularly Australian businesses, I'm always reiterating it, is, we have an unprecedented number of people representing the Australian government up in the region, whether it's through, Austrade or through EFA or, the launch pads and everything that's been set up under the 2040 strategy. And to get Australian businesses to understand that there's never really been a better time, if they wanted support, to get up into the region, to sort of even hear about the region or understand the region, let alone launch a business into the region. I don't think there's a better time than now to do it. And also, I have been in conversations with, for me, the Vietnam government, but talking to the other business champions, it's very similar across the other ASEAN centres where we have these relationships. the governments of these countries are also as keen to unlock this relationship, as keen to see the two-way trade increase with Australia and the whole of the ASEAN bloc. I think it's about proximity. It's about having these long-term relationships that we've had with these countries and the ties that we have culturally. We're not the same culturally, but we do have long, deep ties. If we think about Vietnam and all of the diaspora that we have, there are cultural ties there. There is a familiarity and I guess a sort of feeling of friendship between our two cultures. So I think that has probably surprised me, was just how much the government is willing to roll its sleeves up and help businesses remove blockages, which perhaps they've sort of hit up against in the past and been frustrated by. So I think it's great. I think it creates the perfect environment for us to maximise the opportunity.
Do you think that's a form of de-risking for Australian business, the amount of government push into the region or government support into the region?
Yeah, look, I think so. I mean, these things, you take a business anywhere, even anywhere, you take it into any new geography, even sometimes within Australia, if you take it interstate, there's always an element of risk. But for sure, I think when you've got governments at both ends, if you're looking to take it from one country to another and you've got governments at both ends of that connection, willing to converse and discuss and to sort of give you a bit of a leg up or give you guidance, or in some cases from the Australian government, give you a financial incentive to do it, then it's got to help de-risk it, because often it is, the hurdles that we know that businesses bump up again can be, they come to a different country, they hit up against a different regulation or legislative scheme. They can't navigate their way through the halls of approvals and everything that they need to get their business set up. And having entities like the Australian government and a willingness from the Vietnamese government, if we look at that relationship, it's absolutely got to de-risk it, because speed to market is often one of the factors that is a decisive piece of, are you going to go and do it or not? So yeah, I mean, nothing's without risk, but certainly I would say that the current environment de-risks business opportunities for Australian businesses for sure.
You've built deep long-term relationships with many folks across Asia across the years. Is there one story or insight from a journey that you often come back to, something you might like to share with fellow Australian professionals heading up to the region?
I don't know if there's one story. Look, no, there is one story that always stands out for me, because it was probably best represents this idea of, let's not have outdated views of the value that we can take to the region and have open minds of what that looks like. I remember probably on one of the trade missions that I went on, we ran into this guy he was Vietnamese, but he'd moved to Australia when he was 2 with his parents and had gone back to Vietnam, and his family were all into fabric and making clothes and that. So he sort of grew up in Australia with he said, I grew up with a sewing machine on the end of my bed. I was always destined to do something in that way. And so he'd got his education in Melbourne and then decided he wanted to move back to Vietnam and open up a fashion company. And he wanted to do it with Australian cotton, 100% Australian cotton. And so he set it up so that he would get this cotton imported from Australia. He would then send it out and get yarn, and then he would send it out and get fabric, and then he would use the fabric. And he had this big workshop, and we went in and had a look at it, and they were all making up these, high-end brand fashion items, and then they would export them back to Australia, and you could walk into a Myer or whatever and buy this fashion that he'd made, and it was 100% Australian cotton. And then the companies that were buying it off him in Australia said, well, you're using various supply chain elements. We want you to prove that it's 100% Australian cotton. So he got together with a mate of his in Vietnam, and they put a little crushed up ceramics, and put a digital trace in this imported cotton, and it was at so much %. And then they had this little thing that was supported by blockchain that you scanned it and 5 lights came up, and then it was it had that much % of this trace in it, and then sent it out, bring the yarn back, you could scan it again. And it was a way of tracking and showing that there was nothing else being put into this cotton along this, as it was going through this sort of fragmented supply chain. And I thought that was a fantastic example of innovation and that technology that I spoke about. And I always tell people that story because the really interesting thing about it is, what did Australia put into that? We really put we put the cotton, right? We put the resource, and all of the value and the technology was put in by the Vietnam end of that relationship. So I think it's a bit of an eye-opener into, let's not think 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. There's some really strong skills and especially in that digital tech space. So that's probably one that stands out for me that I was always astonished by.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. That's almost a great story to tell Australian executives heading up, and not to have outdated perceptions or think, in a less sophisticated manner about just how much partnerships and, the value add from the, in this case, from the Vietnamese side. It sounds quite amazing.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, excellent. Look, final question from me. What do you think Australians in business still need to misunderstand about Asian markets? Or perhaps if I was to flip that and put it in a more positive light, what do you wish more of us truly got right about heading to Asia?
Look, I just think, and it's the basis of this 2040 strategy and why we've done it is, we have grown our trade relationships with this region in line with our own GDP growth and not in line with their GDP growth. And, this is a region that as a bloc, and it has absolutely organised itself as the ASEAN bloc so that it, can represent itself from a trading perspective to the world as a significant entity. There's so much opportunity up there. And I think that for Australians, for all sorts of reasons, if we can get really close to these near neighbours and we can formulate this relationship that is not just, it's not just underpinned by a fondness that perhaps comes out of, the last, whatever it is, 50, 60, 70 years of relationships, but is actually underpinned by some real serious economic value being created for each other, some strong political bonds. And, we talk about, when I go around in the region, we often talk about the opportunity that there is through education. We have a lot of people from Southeast Asia that have been educated here in Australia. The diplomatic ties and the business ties long term, that experience of having been educated and go through those formative, fun education years together can bring. I just think for our future prosperity, this is the region that we sort of have to get really close to, and why wouldn't we? They're so close and so interesting, and so much opportunity and so much fun to have in seeking that future linked prosperity that we have together. And I think in the world that is, it's an interesting world, and some would say it's probably as unstable as it's been in our lifetimes right now. These sorts of key relationships are really important, and so I think government is doing a hell of a lot to forge the relationship between government, and I think the more that business can do to support to forge that relationship, there'll be lots of benefit for business over time, and massive benefits for future Australians. So I think it's really exciting, and I think that's why I guess this role is pretty good. I get to be a champion for it as often as I like.
Louise, that's been amazing. I can feel your enthusiasm. It's been a really engaging and insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Giants Next Door podcast.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
For our listeners, thanks for tuning in to the Giants Next Door. If this conversation sparks something in you, be sure to follow the show and share it with others who are thinking seriously about Australia's future with Asia. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.